Hello and welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share terrifying encounters with crawlers. These stories include a young lady who had a terrorizing experience in a graveyard that was followed by dreams and an urge to return, a young man who believes he is being stalked by one or more of these creatures, and a couple who heard unnerving, distorted screaming in the middle of the night while camping. But first, we start with a story from Jamaica where a girl saw a disturbing sight in her bedroom after waking up one night. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a user sharing his sister's encounter with what she initially believed to be an evil spirit, but later discovered it could have been a crawler. Her encounter, which happened in Jamaica, took place in October of 2020. The original poster, or OP, says his sister and mother are very religious, which is what made her believe it was an evil spirit or a case of sleep paralysis. But when he told her what a crawler was and described what one looked like, it fit the description exactly. On the night of her encounter, the OP's sister woke up in the middle of the night, startled by the eerie sensation that she was being watched. A wave of fear washed over her as she glanced towards the bedroom wall. Standing there, she saw a towering, shadowy figure staring at her. She described this thing as extremely emaciated, more so than humanly possible. It had elongated arms that dangled down to its knees and stood taller than 6 feet. Even though she could see the creature's eyes, she couldn't recall the exact color, but believed they emitted an uncanny glow. She was unable to get a clear look at this thing as fear took over, causing her to panic and flee from her room to seek refuge in her mother's room. Neither she nor her mother had the courage to return to her room until the next morning when they woke up. When they did, there was nothing to be found. She told her brother that both her bedroom door and windows were closed. The OP believes the whole incident might have been just a nightmare, but he is intrigued because his sister's description of this creature is exactly like the crawlers he described to her. He ends his post by saying it's weird because he has never come across any accounts of crawlers being sighted in Jamaica. He is curious to see what anyone who comes across his sister's encounter has to say about it. In response to a commenter asking about the cave systems in Jamaica, he said that they do not have cave systems there, and there are no folk tales regarding crawlers in his country. This isn't the first story I've heard where someone wakes up, see what they believe to be a crawler standing over them in their home watching them sleep. In fact, in my most recent episode, I did a story about the same thing happening but with a potential goat man. Now I know these instances could just be explained away as a bad dream or someone just waking up and seeing something that isn't really there. But the main difference here is the original poster felt a presence in her room, which made her believe it was an evil spirit or even sleep paralysis. But then for her brother to describe a crawler to her and for the description to fit exactly what she saw, that's too much of a coincidence for me. Cryptids of all kinds seem to have a morbid curiosity with us, especially when it comes to our homes. This is especially true of dogmen. And being that they seem to be somewhat supernatural, who's to say that they couldn't get into our homes undetected if they wanted to? This is all just speculation on my part though, so take it with a grain of salt. When I read and analyze these stories before using them in episodes, I try to debunk them and look for telltale signs that they are made up. What stood out to me about this one is the brother describing a crawler to his sister and it fitting exactly what she saw that night. Also, in regard to crawlers being in Jamaica, there are reports of cryptids all over the world, including crawlers being seen in Australia and other countries, so I don't see why they couldn't be in Jamaica as well. What do you think about this one? Was it a bad dream or did a crawler get into this girl's house? The next story comes from a poster who had a scary encounter with her boyfriend one night in a graveyard. She does not say where her story takes place, just that it happened 14 years before she posted it online. At first, she believes she encountered a wendigo, but she isn't so sure that's actually what it was. Also, like many other stories I've covered on this channel, her encounter was followed by strange dreams. The night of her encounter, she and her boyfriend ventured into the graveyard at her insistence, being that he told her about something he had seen there. He had also heard stories about the place and a supposed creature there that was a gray humanoid. Supposedly, if you went to the graveyard night after night and sat there, you would eventually see it. After going to the graveyard 3 or 4 nights in a row, he finally caught sight of the creature. He didn't go back after he saw this thing, saying he also had car trouble the night he saw it, but this story piqued his girlfriend's interest and the temptation to see the creature for herself could not be resisted, so off they went to investigate. Well, she would not be disappointed because on their 3rd night going out to the graveyard, there it was, right before their eyes. The couple sat in darkness with only the moon as a source of light, when suddenly both of them were overcome by a spine-chilling sensation for the first time since they started exploring the location. In that moment, they completely changed their minds and decided to flee, vowing never to return. But to their horror, the car, which had never given her any trouble before and wouldn't for years after the incident, refused to start. Her boyfriend was driving and desperately trying to get the engine to turn over. Eventually, it did start, and as the headlights illuminated their surroundings, they witnessed a terrifying sight. Standing right in front of the car was a figure, towering at about 7 feet tall. It was gray, and she describes it as looking like a moving statue. It was hunched over, peering intently through the windshield at them, which left them absolutely terrified and freaking out. As they were about to pull away, the creature darted off with such incredible speed that the OP knew her and her boyfriend's lives were at risk should this thing approach the side windows. She describes this thing as being unbelievably fast, but strangely, instead of running away, it stood to the side of the car watching them intently as they took off. The gravel road they found themselves on made a huge circle within the cemetery, looping back around to the exit, which was also the entrance. The OP says they spun tires and kicked gravel up everywhere the entire way around this giant loop. When they made their way back around to where this thing had been standing watching them, it was still there, unmoving. It stood there watching them as they circled the graveyard and allowed them to leave unimpeded. The whole ordeal was even more terrifying for her as this being's gaze was fixed directly on her, being that the passenger side of the car faced it during their escape. Due to the darkness, she was unable to make out any of its features, but in that moment, she was hit with an overwhelming sense of despair. She describes it as feeling like everyone and everything she cared about in her life had been taken from her right before her very eyes. In that moment, she says the pain and anguish were so strong, it took her breath away. That night, when she was finally able to sleep, she had a bizarre dream where a haunting voice called out to her from the depths of the graveyard, pleading for her to return. She felt like the voice was coming from a pitiful, harmless creature, trapped in eternal solitude within the confines of the old cemetery, completely and utterly alone. Upon waking up, she was determined to go back to the graveyard and find this poor, lonely creature. However, before she was even able to inform her boyfriend of her dream and her decision, she received calls from him and 2 of her best friends, all recounting their own nightmares where this creature had, quote, brutally murdered and mutilated her. The strangest part about this was that the 2 friends who called her had no knowledge of the events that had transpired the previous night. When she had gotten home, it was really late and she hadn't had a chance to tell anyone what happened. In her boyfriend's dream, she had returned to the graveyard out of sympathy for the creature. He had gone out there after her, and when he arrived, he was met with a horrifying sight. The creature was tearing her apart and ripping her open. Following her encounter, she was plagued by recurring dreams where the creature would beg her to come back because it needed help and was suffering. It also reassured her that it meant her no harm. She admits for a while she had to fight the urge to return even after her boyfriend and friends shared their nightmares with her. The allure to return to the graveyard and the creature faded over time, perhaps she believes due to the responsibilities of raising children in everyday life. But she still finds herself thinking about it from time to time, and there's an inexplicable urge to just drive through the graveyard. She says she knows it sounds foolish, but there's always been a persistent whisper in the back of her mind about her encounter and what they witnessed that night. She ends her post by giving a description of the creature, saying it had a masculine physique, yet lacked any genitalia. Its eyes were completely black and devoid of irises or pupils. Just black, inky nothingness, as she puts it. She has done research on what this thing could have been for years, but the only image she's come across that bears any resemblance to this thing are wendigos. The depictions of the wendigos she has come across that bear a striking resemblance to the creature she saw that night aren't the ones depicting them with fur or antlers, just those showing grayish humanoid beings. The incident has haunted her for almost 20 years, and she asks if anyone has any theories or suggestions as to what this creature could have been. It's becoming more and more common for cryptid encounters to be accompanied by weird dreams afterward, and sometimes even before they happen, like in the final story of this episode. This story is a great example of what I've talked about before on this channel, about being careful what you seek out in this world because you never know what you will catch the attention of and these beings attaching themselves to you. I don't think it's a coincidence this creature was staring directly at the OP and then her being the one to have the dream where it beckons her to return to the graveyard. And it almost worked had it not been for 3 people, 2 of which who had no idea about the encounter at the time, having nightmares about what could possibly happen to her if she did go back there. Having heard her boyfriend's story, she was eager to seek this thing out, and the crawler took an interest in her and seemingly attached itself to this young woman, who still, to this day, feels a pull to go back out to that graveyard just to drive through and seek this being out. I'm just glad she hasn't given in to the urge to do so. Also, this isn't the first story I've heard where people have car trouble in the presence of cryptids. They either have the ability to affect cars and electronics, which would point to them being supernatural, or they give off a frequency that keeps cars and electronics from working properly. I do want to point out that the depictions of the Wendigo she described, the ones where they look like gray humanoid figures that are extremely emaciated, are the correct description of that cryptid. The beings seen with antlers, fur, and skull-like faces are not Wendigos, but rather another Native American legend known as the Witchuge. But I believe what she saw that night was actually a crawler. And I will say this again, that you have to be careful what you seek out in this world. What do you think about this one? What do you think she saw that night? And what do you think about the dream she had afterward, as well as the urge to return to the graveyard? The next story comes to us from Minnesota, where the original poster has lived his entire life. For the last 6 to 10 years, he is convinced that he has been stalked by one or more crawlers. He first saw the mysterious figures on an abandoned, overgrown property near the golf course in his hometown. However, their presence didn't confine itself to just that area, as he began catching glimpses of them in the countryside at night. He took to the internet to detail 2 such encounters. One of the most terrifying encounters happened when he was exploring the aforementioned property with his friend. As the 2 boys stood at the entrance of the gravel road, they noticed something perched atop a tree on the opposite side of the lot. The OP's buddy started yelling at the creature and began taunting it. The OP urged his friend to stop, who turned to look at him briefly, but when the boys looked back at the tree, the figure was gone. Right after this, they began hearing what sounded like eerie pig snorts emanating from the nearby brush to their left. Without a second thought, they turned and ran away, staying away from the property for a while. The next encounter, which he says was the weirdest, happened one winter night when he was hanging out with a group of friends. They were driving around when nature called for the OP, so he stepped out of the car to relieve himself. As he stood by the ditch, he happened to glance over at the tree line. Amidst the darkness, he saw a white figure standing upright, looking in his direction. He says it didn't do anything threatening, nor did it make a sound. It simply observed him from a distance of about 75 to 100 yards. Over time, he has shared his bizarre experiences with others. He feels like there are multiple crawlers near where he lives, with one acting aggressively toward him and his friend, and another just wanting to observe him. I just talked about at the end of the last story how these beings take an interest in us and seemingly attach themselves to people. It would seem that this is the case here as well, especially being that the OP feels like he's being stalked by one or more of these creatures. I think if I were him, I would avoid abandoned properties from here on out and being out in or near the woods at night. And I definitely wouldn't give these creatures any attention. Usually if you ignore them, they will lose interest and move on. At least that's what I've gathered in the stories I've read and heard. Unfortunately, this isn't always the case though. What do you think about this one? Is the OP being stalked by one or more crawlers? The final story of this episode comes to us from a young lady who saw something terrifying near Rimrock Lake in Washington State. Rimrock Lake is located on the Titan River in Yakima County, Washington. The original poster was 19 years old at the time and with her boyfriend, who was 26. She begins her story by saying that both she and her boyfriend are very experienced with the outdoors. She has always felt at ease in nature and recently, at the time of her post, went on a 6-week hiking trip down the Pacific Crest Trail. Even when getting close to wildlife, including bears, she has never felt unsafe. Her boyfriend grew up in a rural area surrounded by farmlands, so he too is no stranger to the outdoors. Their encounter happened when they decided to take a trip to Rimrock Lake, an area, according to her, that has a lot of Native American history, land, and people living there. However, it may not be directly relevant to her story, but she thought it was worth mentioning. They arrived at the lake at around 10:45 p.m. As they approached the entrance, a sense of unease washed over her. It was a feeling she had only experienced a few times in her life, which she told her boyfriend about immediately. The place was giving her a really bad vibe. He, however, downplayed her trepidation, attributing it to being afraid of the dark. As the car brought them around a curve, a wave of realization hit the OP and she realized she had seen that place before in a dream from her childhood. Upon realizing this, she shared her dream with her boyfriend, emphasizing that every detail matched what she saw as a child. In her dream, she recalls a pale, creepy face with eyes that reflected the light, peering out from her from the trees. This caused her to turn and run down the road, desperately trying to escape. Her boyfriend listened to the account of her dream, but ultimately didn't put much stock into it. They continued on their way, arriving at the campsite. They set up their tent, got a fire going, and her boyfriend had a cigar lit in the span of about 15 minutes. When they were done, they settled around the campfire when they suddenly heard a wild, loud scream. The OP describes it as sounding like a bunch of really drunk college kids. However, she says it sounded a bit off. It sounded like men and women screaming in perfect unison, according to her, with the high and low screams melding together. She tried to rationalize the sound in an attempt to make sense of it and points out that it was approximately a mile away just over a hill. But moments later, they heard this unnerving scream again, except this time it was coming from the opposite direction. And it was a lot closer. By her estimation, it was about half a mile away. This time she says it sounded more disturbing and she knew it was not a human at all. The second time they heard it, the scream was more distorted than before. The couple, remaining as quiet as they could, began talking about the scream and how it was not normal. Neither of them, in their many years of being outdoors and traveling, had never heard anything that sounded remotely similar to the screams they heard that night. The screams around them continued to grow ever closer until it was no more than 100 yards away. By this time, her boyfriend had set his cigar aside and grabbed his firearm. The couple decided it would be best to ignore the screams and not mention them for the rest of the night. They eventually retreated to their tent and awakened the next morning to a beautiful day. However, they soon noticed that the cigar had vanished. Throughout the day, they talked about it briefly, and the mere thought of it still creeps them out. The OP believes that when she and her boyfriend heard the screams at a distance, whatever was doing the screaming was actually dangerously close. She goes on to say that these creatures possess the uncanny ability to create the illusion of distance when in reality they are nearby. And she has also heard that the farther away the sound, the nearer they actually are. She ends her post by asking anyone who reads her story for their thoughts, feelings, and opinions on what happened to her and her boyfriend. She goes on to admit that after discussing what happened with users in a Skinwalker forum, there have been quite a few instances happening in that exact location, with people having eerily similar encounters. She closes with a warning, and that is to stay away from Rimrock Lake. The absolute last thing I would want to hear in the middle of the night while camping is a bone-chilling, distorted scream, much less have it seemingly move toward my campsite while coming from different directions. I've also heard the same thing about cryptids she mentions in this story, about when the screams or noises seem farther away, the creatures behind them are closer than you think, and when they seem close, they are farther away. Also, it would seem that whatever was out there with them that night came into their camp while they slept, being that her boyfriend's cigar disappeared without a trace. That is almost as unsettling as the screaming. Another thing I want to mention here is how she had the dream of the exact place before her and her boyfriend went to camp there, and the fact that she saw a crawler-like creature in the dream. The screams she describes sound like what people normally describe crawlers as sounding like when they scream. That's why I included it in a crawler episode. But being that there is no physical sighting or description, I can't say for certain what I think might have been out there with them that night. And the fact that she used the word distorted to describe the scream makes me think it was not a normal animal that produced the noise. There's also the feeling she got when they arrived at the campsite, which is one a lot of people get before and during encounters. It's almost like there is a palpable evil given off by these creatures that engulf the area they roam and affect people when they come into that territory. I'm just glad that nothing else happened that night and the cigar was the only thing that went missing from the camp. What are your opinions of this story? And what would you do if you heard distorted screaming while camping in the middle of the night? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.